There we are. Well, good morning. We have folks kind of stretching from the East Coast to the Midwest, all the way over to at least South Dakota, and from up here, not too far from Canada, going down to at least as far south as Missouri, and perhaps a little further south than that. Delighted to have you all with us this morning as we engage in our first for 2019 quarterly member webinar on decarbonizing electricity. This is an opportunity for us both to gather as members of SGI, along with some of our allies and friends, and also to incorporate some of those colleagues who work with us to help us develop a deeper awareness and understand how we make the world within which we live. Today's is a exciting chapter for us, and we're delighted to have so many of you here with us. So why don't we move on to the next slide, Frank? Just so you know then, we're going to start with everybody in listen-only mode. Again, the slides and the recording will be made available after this webinar. When we hit the time for question and answer, we'll set it up so that you can unmute yourself to ask a question of our speakers. And just as an opening reflection then, I thought we could begin with a prayer for our earth, part of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. All-powerful God, who are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures, you embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. Amen. In our conversation today, we'll feature three particular companions. In the first portion, we'll be hearing from Frank Sherman, who's the Executive Director of SGI, as you know. In the second portion, we'll be hearing from Franz Litz, who is a programming consultant with the Great Plains Institute. They have done tremendous work in a roadmap for decarbonization in the Midcontinent sector. And so we'll be hearing particularly about some opportunities for advancing our work from Franz. And finally, we'll be hearing from Dan Bakal, who is Senior Director for Electric Power at Ceres. SGI is a member of Ceres. Dan has been a really important collaborator with us. When we engage the utilities here in the upper Midwest, Dan, along with Christina Herman of ICCR, are the two people who are kind of most knowledgeable experts sitting with us in the midst of those conversations. In many ways, we really rely upon them and delighted for their help and encouragement and accompaniment. And so the agenda then, those three portions, Frank's going to set the stage, talking a little bit about the contemporary context of where we are on climate change and utilities in the US and globally. Then we'll talk about the roadmap to decarbonization, and then we'll talk about the investor role on that journey, followed by some time for questions and answers. And with this, I'll hand it off to Frank.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think I'm unmuted. And welcome everyone to both our members of SGI and our guest. So I'll be setting the stage, upon which Franz and Dan will give some specifics on how the Midcontinent electricity generation sector will decarbonize over the next 30 years. And I start with what I call undeniable weather patterns. We're seeing significant frequency of extreme weather events. And I think the general public is starting to slowly recognize and become aware of the difference between short-term weather and long-term climate patterns. And this was witnessed most recently here in the Midwest with the polar vortex a couple weeks ago, which was explained by the scientists as a result of melting Arctic polar cap and the polar vortex that sits in the stratosphere above the North Pole and the splitting of that vortex. So these things are becoming more and more in the public eye. But as we learned from the IPCC special report issued last fall, just before the COP24 in Poland, that countries, companies, societies are not doing enough to face this challenge, and to stay below that 1.5 degrees centigrade in atmospheric temperature rise. Meeting that challenge will require rapid escalation in both the current scale and pace of change. And then right after that, COP24 came out with a rule book for reporting emissions and progress towards cutting them. But many were disappointed that this COP did not echo that urgent call made by the IPCC report. However, in December, the fourth National Climate Assessment Report put out by the United States by 300 federal and non-federal experts. This report was approved by 13 federal agencies before it was issued. This was volume 2. And their conclusion was, without substantial and sustained global migration, or global mitigation and regional adaptation efforts, climate change is expected to cause growing losses in American infrastructure and property and impede the rate of economic growth over this century. So they echoed that alarm from the IPCC. So the other thing that's happened in the last couple of few months is the midterm elections, and this resulted in what some call a blue wave, but certainly the switch or the flip of the House of Representatives and 7 state governors from Republican to Democrat. We now have 21 states that have joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, committing to the Obama-era U.S. goal under the Paris Climate Agreement. The latest of which was our good Governor Walker, it's echoes of the past, our new governor in Wisconsin, Governor Evers, just this week joined that U.S. Climate Alliance. 13 states now have either joined California or considering joining California and setting a target of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050 or sooner. We saw announcements in Colorado, New York, and Pennsylvania supporting these moves, both with renewable energy commitments, energy efficiency and storage commitments, and commitments for electrification of the transport sector. And then finally, last week, the House of Representatives submitted for consideration a non-binding resolution called the Green New Deal, which called for massive public investment in renewable energy and the power grid, as well as investment in transportation and manufacturing in an effort to be net zero emissions in the U.S. economy by mid-century. So we see some changing tides here. Nonetheless, the current administration continues to prop up coal and nuclear power, but in some cases, market realities are moving too quickly. In the case of the TVA, they announced closures of 2 more coal plants just recently due to both cost and turn down flexibility that are provided by gas and renewable energy that coal and nuclear just don't provide. Coal and nuclear plants have to run at nearly 100% utilization in order to operate. Then last August, the EPA announced a rollback of the CAFE standards that were set for the 2020 to 2026 period. This also will have an impact, but many feel the growth of electric vehicles will happen irregardless of this rollback. Now, despite all these happenings, public opinion still lacks the urgency that's needed. Despite many economists, environmentalists, and some political figures, companies believe that a carbon tax is needed. Many in the U.S. public don't want to pay for it. So this public opinion, the University of Chicago recently did a poll which showed that over 70% of Americans believe climate change is a reality and believe human activity is primarily responsible. However, just 40% support taxing the use of carbon-based fuels. And in an Oxford research study, they find that attitudes towards climate change are shaped mostly by short-term economic factors and economic self-interest. Although with more societal, social, and individual affluence, there is an increasing concern regardless of the economic conditions. Now we see that in the meantime, renewable energy costs has dropped significantly. Over the past decade, we see that the current full cycle costs for both building and operating renewables are now, the cost of that is below the incremental operating cost of coal and nuclear. And by next year, renewables, to build a renewable energy facility and operate it will be cheaper or competitive with gas. However, financial advisory firm Lazard contends that despite the increasingly cost competitive renewables and the promise of storage technology, alternative energy systems alone will not be capable of meeting the base load generation needs for the foreseeable future. And they promote an optimal solution of complementary, conventional, and alternative energy. And I think if you read the IPCC report, they'll show that in order to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, technologies such as carbon capture will be needed if we hope to reach our targets. So in the meantime, the electricity sector is fully aware of these dynamics. The displacing of aging coal plants with cheaper natural gas and cost-competitive renewables have been taking place. In fact, 2018 was a watershed year in the shutdown of coal plants. Both businesses and government customers are demanding renewable energy for their supply. In addition, this sector is starting to cooperate with the transport sector and with local and state governments to start to install or accelerate the installation of infrastructure for the electric vehicle shift. However, with that backdrop, the reality hit when last month the research firm Rhodium Group reported that in 2018, the U.S. power sector increased their greenhouse gas emissions after 3 years of declines based on higher electricity demand and increased natural gas-fired generation, outpacing the coal power decline. This chart shows a lot of the voluntary reduction targets set by many electricity companies, many of them in the Midwest. You see, this is not a comprehensive list, but it's some of the more aggressive targets. I've highlighted the companies that seventh generation interfaith members are engaging here in the Midwest. Now, many of these targets fall short of the 90% needed for this sector for the 2-degree temperature rise, not to mention the net zero emissions called for by the recent IPCC report. So more needs to be done. I'll also note that setting ambitious targets is not enough. It's maybe the first step. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommended that companies need to also establish strong governance, develop implementation and CapEx plans that are consistent with these targets and with Paris, a climate agreement, and finally to have transparent disclosure on the progress. Now, I believe we're at a tipping point for this sector, and I think between the political climate, increased public awareness, lowering renewable costs, and investor demands, that we can accelerate this transition. And with that, I'll pass it off to Franz.
Great, thanks so much, Frank. I appreciate that. I'll just let you know when to advance the slide. Is that how we're doing it, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thanks again, Frank and Seventh Generation. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm with the Great Plains Institute, and the Great Plains Institute is an energy think tank of sorts. I say of sorts because we do the traditional research and thought leading that a think tank attempts to do, but we have a different approach. We tend to bring diverse interests together around a table, and we try to tackle complex problems like climate change or like decarbonizing the electricity sector together. And we think, you know, by bringing the kind of humility that type of coming together requires, we're more likely to reach durable solutions. And I'm here today to talk to you about one of our efforts in that vein. We are working on a roadmap to decarbonization in the Midcontinent. And by Midcontinent, we mean the upper Midwest, all the way south to Louisiana and Mississippi. It's the area that's covered by the Midcontinent Independent System Operator. They run the electricity system for the middle of the country. So that's why we picked that region. We've gathered stakeholders from all sides, or representing most sides, I should say, around the table to plan, to think about what a decarbonized electricity sector looks like, and to think about what it might mean to electrify transportation and to electrify buildings to a greater extent, to serve those end users with clean electricity, cleaner and cleaner electricity as we go as we move toward mid-century. You can advance the slide. This is a list of folks that signed on to our electricity sector roadmap. It's a partial list of participants. We also have other Midwest utilities, including Alliant, Ameren, Consumers, Entergy, that are part of this effort. They just didn't end up signing onto this this document either because they weren't as actively engaged or didn't agree with everything that was in here. We also have some other state agency observers, including Arkansas. We've had Illinois involved in Iowa, and we see Michigan and Minnesota. You can go to the next page. So what we did when we started this effort, we said Trump had just been elected, and we got everyone around the table and we said, what do we expect to happen? And by and large, whether we were hearing from an environmentalist or a utility, folks around the table felt like decarbonization is in our future, whether it's required. And I think most people think it will be required by the time we get to mid-century, or it's going to happen through voluntary action or through market forces. There was general agreement that we were going to need to get to decarbonization by mid-century. And I think you see that agreement in the targets that Frank had on the prior slide. Although I agree with Frank that targets do not mean action, and targets in order to be met require action. We started with our effort by saying, all right, what do we expect to happen in the region's electricity sector if no new actions are taken? And you're looking at a chart, and when I show you a chart, I'm going to tell you what to take away from the chart. I always appreciate that because it takes me a long time to figure out a chart, unless it's one I've been working with. What you're looking at is a range of potential emissions outcomes in the electricity sector through 2050. We ran dozens. We used a fancy computer program to project what would happen in the electricity sector in the region between now and 2050. And the reason we ran lots of scenarios is we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Our renewables cost is going to continue to decline rapidly. Our natural gas price is going to stay low, or are they going to come back up, and the like. And those two factors, renewables costs and natural gas costs, it turns out, are the biggest factors that will determine what the sector looks like in the absence of new action. We call this the gray whale because it's daunting. It's big like a gray whale. If we don't do anything in this sector, there's a chance that emissions will rise, and then maybe they'll dip a teeny bit by 2050, but essentially not fall enough to address climate change. The blue and the green lines are the lines that the group felt are the most likely scenarios, and they're tied to renewables costs and natural gas costs. If natural gas costs stay low, as most people are projecting, we would end up with the blue line. And though that shows a reduction in the sector without new action, you can see that the reduction is not enough because we're starting at just under 500 million metric tons, and we're ending at just under 300. And we need to be, I think most people agree, we need to be somewhere between 80 and 95% below 2005 levels by 2050 in order to have a hope at staying within 2 degrees. You can go to the next slide. So we also said, all right, we got a sense of what would happen if we took no new action. What if we required the system to reduce by 95% by mid-century? And we ran all of those scenarios. These are all available on our website, by the way. You can play with the different factors and toggle them on and off if you think the future is going to look different than these two scenarios I'm about to show you. But if natural gas prices tend to stay low, as most analysts are projecting now, this is the kind of decarbonization scenario we might expect. What do you take from this slide? I hope that you'll take that it's going to take a mix of solutions. Renewables are shown there in green, and solar is in the kind of light orange, second to the top. But you also have their nuclear plants, which in a decarbonization scenario do stick around because there would be a economic incentive for them to stick around. They don't have any emissions. And so they could be an important part of the decarbonization mix. And then you have natural gas plants sticking around. So this is important. If you've been thinking that renewables is going to get us there 100% of the way, you might want to think again. Most decarbonization analyses done, even though the one done by the Obama administration that was released shortly before he left office, found that we were going to be relying pretty heavily on natural gas combined with carbon capture and storage in 2050. And that's true of virtually every decarbonization analysis that's been done worldwide. The only time it doesn't call on CCS, carbon capture and storage, is when they specifically do not let the model pick carbon capture and storage. So in a future where gas prices stay low, we might anticipate that natural gas will still be in the picture, and we ought to be focused on making sure that natural gas is controlled, that we have controls on the end of the stacks that capture the carbon and make sure it does not go into our atmosphere. Next slide. So on the next slide, you have an even bigger mix, because in this scenario, we assumed natural gas prices were going to go up higher than a lot of people think, and they reach moderate levels. And what happens if natural gas prices go up is other types of resources can compete more easily with natural gas. And so you have here wind doing much better, solar doing better. We actually have new nuclear plants being built in our analysis when we have gas not being so cheap. But even with moderate gas prices, we have gas with carbon capture and storage. That's that rusty orange in the bottom right in the slide. So the takeaway from both of these slides and the analysis more generally is we can get there. These analyses show that we can get to 95% decarbonization. We're not waiting for a breakthrough in technology. These are things that are there. But we ought to approach the solution with great humility, not assume we have the answers. A lot of people assume renewables are the answers, and they push it sort of vehemently and stridently. But this analysis tends to show we ought to approach it with humility, make sure we keep our options open, make sure that we have the ability to tackle the problem as we move toward mid-century. That may mean keeping nuclear plants around. That may mean carbon capture and storage on fossil plants. Not so much coal, because natural gas is going to outcompete coal, but on natural gas plants. Next slide. So I just said that. We can skip this slide. So the group then, after looking at this analysis, which was a lot of fun to do, and they all agreed on the various scenarios, which is powerful in and of itself. And we're trying to reach decision makers in the region and nationally with this analysis to let them know, hey, when we bring utilities and environmental groups and state officials around the table together, these are the kinds of things they agree on. And that ought to be powerful to you. This ought to tell you that these are the kinds of things you can do, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Cost-effective energy efficiency and renewables. That was the number one. That should be the first thing that folks do. We need to keep our eye on other resources, however, very low and zero carbon resources. That would be carbon capture and storage on gas plants, for example, and nuclear plants. The decisions on existing nuclear plants, which tend to be based on economics these days because people are not taking carbon into account enough, ought to take carbon into account. Next slide. Importantly, when you look at this problem long term, one of the key things is that investors in utilities have this in mind and ought to continue to have this in mind. There are risks in the future. We're likely to finally get around to doing something about climate change at the federal level and at the state level. And there's a risk to investing in carbon emitting resources, even natural gas plants. So utilities need to take that into account before making that choice. We found that there's lots more room for renewables. So even though I said renewables may not be the only answer, we're not even close to the level of maximum renewables on the system. So there ought to be a doubling and tripling down on renewables. But any policy ought to be flexible to allow for step changes, because we may see some great innovations on storage that makes storage much cheaper. We may see great innovations on carbon capture and storage that makes it more cheaper. We may see the next generation of nuclear plants come around that makes them a viable economic solution as well. Next slide. So we did that with the electricity sector. We put that roadmap out in July of last year, and then we turned to look at the transportation piece of this and what happens when we think about cars going from gasoline and diesel, cars and trucks going from gasoline and diesel to electrified, battery electric. And we did a roadmap for that too, and we released that at the end of January. You can go to the next slide. And I'm just going to hit on this because I know you're focused mostly on the electricity sector, but I'm hitting on this because, boy, these are two huge outcomes for the region. A lot of folks, when they think about electric vehicles in the Midwest, they think, well, you know, don't we have a lot of coal plants on the system? Are we really better off if we switch from a gasoline car to an electric vehicle? And the answer is an emphatic yes, we are better off. Even right now with the current mix of the system, we are much better off with electric vehicles than we are with gas vehicles. And then if you think about the graphs I showed you, which tended to show the electric sector getting cleaner over time, even in the absence of action, then those emission benefits just get even better. And that's only talking about carbon. If you think about the other pollutants which cause human health problems, nitrogen oxides, which lead to smog, and very small particulates in the lungs of people who can't tolerate harmful particulate matter. The shifting from cars and gasoline and diesel to electricity is going to result in big reductions in those pollutants. And that's because power plants control for those pollutants very heavily, whereas cars and trucks do not. And then on the electricity system alone, one of the issues with renewable generation like wind and solar is it isn't generating all the time. And so we need to figure out ways to get lots of it on the system and deal with it from an engineering perspective. One big way we could maximize our renewables on the system is to have manageable load, such as a fleet of electric cars or electric cars where we encourage people to charge late at night when the system could use the wind energy that may not be used now. And in our analysis, we found the system could save billions just by better using the resources that are already built that sometimes either sit idle or they run, you know, like wind turbines running in the middle of the night when the power is not being used, run when the electricity is sort of just wasted or burned off the wire. So those were the two big ones on EVs. You can go to the website. That's at roadmap.betterenergy.org. And go to Great Plains Institute website and see roadmap at the top too, and check it out. You can access all the modeling results there as well. So I think I've probably taken too much time. Thanks for your patience, and I look forward to now listening to Dan.
Thank you, Franz. That was really great. Dan, why don't you take it over?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you both Frank and Christopher for the opportunity. It's really been a pleasure to collaborate with you and your colleagues on and to really engage with some of the power companies in the Midwest. And yeah, I know we want to definitely leave time for questions, so I'm going to move quickly. There's a little bit of redundancy with some of our slides, so I might move quickly through some of them. Just a quick mention on who we are. Ceres, we are a nonprofit organization based here in Boston. We have a company network, which has a range of large companies, 50 plus of them, that we engage with on sustainability issues and really try to push them to address some of the key challenges they have. We have a policy network where we work with companies in our BICEP, or Businesses for Climate and Energy Policy, to advocate for good climate and energy policies. We also have, really at our core, a nonprofit network that includes environmental nonprofits, as well as many other social and labor organizations that are part of our network. And what really we're going to focus on the most here today is our investor network that has continued to grow. Now it's 160 or more institutional investors of all different kinds. It does include faith-based institutional investors, ESG-minded investors, large public pension funds, as well as several large asset managers. And so there's a lot of variability in our investor network, but there is a commitment to engage on key sustainability challenges and to both address their own portfolios as well as engage with companies and industries on issues like climate change. And then I think this has been addressed pretty well, but I just want to flag that from our standpoint, the IPCC 1.5C report was a really powerful report that highlighted the urgency around climate change even more than we had already known, and really did, in some ways, raise the bar around the need to try to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. There was, of course, a lot of talk around a 2-degree target, or well below 2 degree, but there's even more focus now on the real need to try to limit temperature rise to 1.5, which would require essentially complete decarbonization of our economy by 2050, which is no small task. So we can move on to the next slide. And this also has been covered a bit, but I just want to make sure people really understand where our electricity comes from. And so the chart on the left shows that we, historically have gotten an enormous amount of our electricity from coal, which is in the brown there, and also a lot from natural gas, and moving up to nuclear, and some from renewables, and even a tiny bit from petroleum or other resources. But the main point here is coal has been in the decline, natural gas has been growing, nuclear has remained quite flat for quite some time now, and we have seen substantial growth in renewables. And the chart on the right just breaks out the renewable portion, where you can see in blue legacy hydro, the large-scale hydro that was built decades ago, remains a huge portion of our renewable resource. But what you can see there, especially in the green and in the yellow toward the top, is that the wind has grown quite a bit in really the last decade or so, with solar also. While it's still a small portion, it is a rapidly growing electricity resource, but still a modest part of the overall pie. And then this chart, I'll move quickly through, but you can see on the left there that emissions have been dramatically reduced. Sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. This just goes back to 2000, but you can see dramatic reductions in those, and as well as some substantial reductions in carbon dioxide, although, as was mentioned, there was a bit of an uptick in power sector CO2 emissions in 2018 based on the most recent estimates. So there's a little uptick there. In the middle, that shows sort of what we just saw in the prior slide, but just a different way of looking at it. Dramatic growth in natural gas since 2000, dramatic growth in renewables, pretty flat for nuclear, and declines in coal, as well as in the final image, that GDP growth has been fairly steady in the last decade, whereas the total amount of generation has been pretty flat. And looking back at the CO2, we have managed to decouple CO2 growth from GDP growth, which is encouraging, although 2018 was a little concerning. So next slide. When you look at the power sector, you do want to look at where their generation is coming from and how that impacts their CO2 emission rate. So we put out a report every year. It's called Benchmarking Air Emissions, and you can look at emissions from the biggest power generators in the US and look at the data in a wide variety of ways. This is just one chart, and it shows for the 20 largest power companies by generation, what is their CO2 emissions rate, meaning how many pounds do they release per megawatt hour of electricity they produce. Up at the top, you can see Exelon, which has an enormous amount of nuclear generation with the lowest emission rate by far. All the way at the bottom, PPL with the highest emission rate, and that's because the vast majority of their electricity that they generate comes from coal. And then there's a whole range through the middle, but it's good to really understand, what their fuel mix is, and because that's a primary driver of the emissions rate. Next slide. Now, Frank did have a similar chart. This one is focused on the 10 largest power companies by CO2 emissions, and it has both their total tons of emissions and then what commitments they've made. And I think, as Frank pointed out, these are not consistent with the levels of decarbonization we need. However, I will say, having engaged with this industry for so many years, this is a significant step forward, because really these commitments all have come within the past year or year and a half. And for so many years, power companies were saying they could not set 2050 goals. It would not, it would put them out, they would not be aligned with their regulators and policymakers, and also they didn't have the confidence to be able to set such long-range goals. So now that we've seen them set these, I think we're now entering into a phase where we have to increase their level of confidence that they can achieve them and ratchet up their ambition. And I think the Excel commitment was a substantial one, the CMS one as well. Those are some pretty steep reductions that companies have set, and we need to continue to engage with companies like these. Next slide. So just taking a look at one specific company, AEP, which is either the first or second largest CO2 emitter in the US, depending upon the year. Sometimes Duke Energy is a little bit higher than them. They made their commitment in April of last year. And again, that was after many years of saying they couldn't set a goal like this. So, and it was substantial. They're a 60% reduction by 2030 and a 80% reduction by 2050. And this also, I would give them credit for laying out what their emissions are going back to 2000. Many companies don't do that. They just provide isolated data points. So this is encouraging. However, at the same time, you can see they've reduced emissions by 44% since 2000, and yet their goal for 2030 is 60%. So what it shows is that they're not being that ambitious. They probably need a higher level of confidence in order to be able to set a more ambitious 2030 goal, which could then put them on a trajectory for a higher reduction by 2050. It was an important step forward for the company, and they do acknowledge the role that their customers have played in really pushing them toward clean energy, as well as investors, which is important, because a substantial portion of their shareholders are focused on much more short-term returns and earnings. But to hear from a lot of some of their bigger shareholders saying, we're very concerned about this issue from a risk standpoint, we want to see you set long-range greenhouse gas reduction goals, was very meaningful. Let's go on to the next slide. And then another important thing about the AEP commitment was, looking forward, as they talk about how they're retiring their coal fleet, they're also talking about the generation capacity additions that they plan to add. So in the top there, this looks out to 2030. You can see that the sun is just an image for all of the solar that they plan to add. These are not set in stone, but these are just rough proposals of what they plan to build over the next decade or so. So you can see 3,000 megawatts of solar, 5,300 megawatts of wind. That's a substantial amount of renewable energy. 1,400 megawatts of natural gas, which don't even start to come out till the middle part of the decade, or 2022 to 2027. So there's still opportunity to influence some of those natural gas plants, I'd say. And next slide. Now, this is a slide that Frank said gave him a headache, which I completely understand. I just wanted to mention it briefly because it's a useful tool. You don't have to be able to read this right now. What the main point I want to make here is that when we look at electric utilities around the country, it's really useful to know really what their service territories are and who their customers are. If you go to EEI, Edison Electric Institute, they're the trade association. If you can just Google EEI service member map, and you can see this map and get a list also of all of the subsidiaries that are under one parent company. So you can really get a sense of where the utilities are, who their customers are, and where their generation comes from. So it's a useful resource. I just wanted to mention it very quickly. And we could go on to the next slide. We've also developed what we call our climate strategy assessment for the power sector. And the main point here is that companies can't just set targets because people are asking them to. They really have to do a deep dive on the climate science and understand, what's driving the request for these kinds of reductions. So we provide some guidance to companies as to how they should go about the process to to do scenario analysis that then will impact their business plans and their goal setting. And that's consistent with what the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has called for. So we provide some specific guidance, and we even are working on updating it in light of the recent IPCC 1.5C report. Finally, I'll mention that, as we all probably know, policy is so critical to achieving these reductions. Companies cannot just make the reductions, without the right kind of policies in place at the state or federal level. We've been advocating with businesses in a whole bunch of states where we support whether it's a governor taking action. In this case, it was North Carolina, where we got a number of companies to support the governor's executive order around climate and clean energy, or it can be with the legislature to expand a renewable portfolio standard or defend an energy efficiency measure. So there's a lot of activity that needs to happen at the state and federal level to get the policies in place, and we're active on that as well. And that, of course, has a significant impact on what electric power companies are able to do. The only other thing I know, there was another slide I was going to include around our effort called Climate Action 100+. So I think many of you should think of yourselves as part of a broader coalition of investors that are all quite focused on climate change. It's called Climate Action 100+. Investors around the world focused on, with $32 trillion in assets under management, focused on 161 of the systemically most important greenhouse gas emitters globally. And that does include a number of power companies, about a dozen in North America. And we are, collaborating with these investors globally to really put pressure on companies to focus on the issue. And I'll leave it there because I know we've run a little bit long.
Chris, if I can jump in before you open up the lines.
Okay.
We have Tom Content of the Wisconsin Citizens Utility Board on the line. And so I promised Tom to give him 2 minutes to talk about just transition in this decarbonization. Tom, you're unmuted. Go ahead. I thought Tom was out there.
He was. Yeah, he's there.
Yeah, I have him unmuted. Tom, are you there?
He may be also on a phone.
Yeah, he may be off. Okay, good. Go ahead, Chris.
Tom? But I think he also may have called in on a phone, so I just unmuted a phone. Well.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Well, this has been really helpful and encouraging, both the contributions from Frank, from Franz, and Dan. Again, kind of pulling it together. We're at a critical point is part of what Frank was talking about. Franz talked about some of the very concrete possibilities before us, and Dan was also talking about some of the role that we as shareholders have and as customers, as consumers. And thinking even about the map that Dan showed us, knowing that we're in different parts of the country, and kind of thinking about who provided the electricity for your router, for your internet, who provided the electricity for your laptop or cell phone or desktop computer that we're using to be communicating with one another today, and how we might be able to engage those companies to make them better in their care for creation. Questions from the floor then? Things that you'd like to ask of our panel?
This is Ruth Garretts from Aberdeen, South Dakota.
Yeah, Sister Ruth, please.
And our community presentation sisters has been engaging with CMS Energy out of Michigan. And we find them to be quite responsive. We've had help from Ceres and ICCR staff on this. they've set some very aggressive goals. And in fact, the latest one is 92% reduction by 2050. And so what I'm wondering is, Franz, do you think that shareholders presenting questions and challenging these companies make a difference, or do you think they're mostly operating out of the better economics of renewables and political pressure?
This is Franz. I do not doubt that it makes a difference. I think it's one of the key things that has led to the setting of goals and targets. Part of it, I think, I think of utilities as they're like large ocean liners. They don't turn on a dime. They have to be slowly turned. And I think investor action, investor resolutions have been really important. And also just the discussion of policy. So the 8 years during the Obama administration, where we focused on what was called the Clean Power Plan, standards for power plants that would reduce emissions. They were relatively modest. They were going to get us 32% by 2030. But when you have utilities, these big ocean liners thinking about how to get there, 12 years from now, and then you have a change in administrations that, the Trump administration has come in and they've been rolling everything back that Obama did. But I think what we're seeing on the part of the business community and utilities in particular is they're not turning back. They don't turn on a dime to go back either. And they've figured out that there is a business proposition that makes sense in a low carbon, decarbonized system. Now, one more thing, I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but the point that right now a lot of the market situation, the market trends are lining up with decarbonization. That won't always be the case. What we saw in our analysis is by the time you get to early 2030, you start to see pressure on the system again that is likely to lead to either emissions leveling out or going back up. And so we still have to focus on policy. We have to get back to a place where the policy discussions and the policies being implemented line up with these goals. So I agree with Dan on that.
Thanks, Sister Ruth, for that question, and thanks, Franz, for the reply. Dan, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
I think that covered it pretty well. If I could, I was going to make a comment about just transition. So since that wasn't able to be addressed, I'm happy to chime in on that. Is that okay?
Please do.
Yeah, I did want to mention that as part of this Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, investors do see the need for a just transition and the need to really focus on, as this transition happens and even accelerates, that we really need to be focusing on communities that are impacted, whether it's a community that has a coal plant that's being shut down, or it's a community that's being impacted by the extreme weather or the physical impacts of climate change. So there's a recognition on the part of investors that as companies develop their carbon transition plans and their business strategies, that just transition and impact on communities has to be part of the puzzle. So I'm sorry I didn't mention that in my presentation, but it really is part of the really part of the package.
If I could jump in with a question, then, and both Franz and Dan, I'd like to get your reaction. We've since the Excel announcement in December for targeting or setting a goal for net zero emissions by 2050. We've had utility companies we've engaged with, some of which call this target inspirational, and others call it irresponsible. So I guess I'd like to get your reaction, because there is now a push, given the IPCC report which reminds us of the reality. There is a push now from the investment community to target net zero for 2050. So if you can react to that. Franz, maybe you start?
Yep. Do you want to go, Franz?
Oh, sure. There is, you know, we've been talking about carbon risk for years and years and years now. You know, it's this notion that if you're in a carbon intensive industry and in the face of the mounting and undeniable evidence of climate change, you really have to stare it in the face, and you have to say to yourself, well, are we gonna be able to continue business as usual? Or will the environment, and I mean that quite literally, as well as the political environment, be such that we need to decarbonize? I think what we're finally seeing with these targets is a recognition that decarbonization will be necessary. What I'm less, and therefore prudent. You know, there's this, it just makes sense to address the carbon risk, especially when you have lower cost renewables, especially when natural gas is so much cheaper than coal. That's why we see those reductions in AEP's recent history that Dan showed on his slide. It's because of the market is lining up to make it, to lend some economic sense along with the carbon risk. But I just want to say once again, we can't rest on that, right? We can't rest on low gas prices and declining renewables costs, because that may not continue. And we, you know, so the need to have policy that supports the decarbonization goal sooner rather than later is an imperative.
Yep, totally agree. And I would just add that I do think, you know, for many of these companies, they can see to 2030 and maybe even 2035 with a pretty good amount of clarity, and can have a good level of confidence in being able to achieve some of the targets based on the fleets they have and where they think they're going to be adding generation. But looking out to 2050, I think is much more challenging for them and does require a certain leap of faith. And that's where I do find the Xcel Energy commitment fairly inspiring. Now, keep in mind, it's only covering its electricity side of its business, not the natural gas distribution side. That's another area where you know, the company really needs to look at how it's going to decarbonize the natural gas that it distributes to so many customers, along with many of the other electric, in quotes, electric utilities that have significant natural gas distribution arms. So that's another big question that needs to be addressed.
Hi, this is Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes, sister.
Okay. I really appreciated this presentation, and my concern is on the CCS. I've been following Ameren since probably 2008, and we've involved with them mostly on water issues, but the CCS issue is a concern because of the expense, number one, and the effect on our water systems, where they're going to, you know, sort of drill down into the water table and release the carbon, unless there's been some change in the technology. So can either of you speak to that?
Since I was the one who mentioned CCS, I'll jump in. I guess I want to start with a comment about needing to bring a level of humility to this question. I feel like we're very eager to jump to the mix that's going to get us there, right? We want to say now that we can decide what exactly the makeup of the final decarbonized mix is going to be. And I want to say maybe we've got time, number one, and costs are going to change a lot. But I would agree with you that if the cost of carbon capture and storage does not decrease, it it won't be, it's much less likely to be part of the mix, especially if there are corresponding advances on energy storage, which make renewables higher levels of renewables attainable. Also, the other big question mark here in the next 20 years is if we have an electrified economy that's a smart electrified economy, both buildings and vehicles, we're going to have a much more control over not just, how and when we generate resources, electricity, but when we consume them. And it's going to make a much more cost-effective system. And so, right now, for example, when we build wind, we're assuming that some of that energy is not going to be used. But if we could, when we're about to build a new wind farm, if we could assume that it was all going to be used, then the economics of that project all of a sudden are much better, and we can start to envision that positive future. We don't know though if it's going to play out exactly as we hope, and so that's why we need to, I think, be open to solutions that might not meet, a green, the greenest environmental test. We have people who want to keep all the fossil in the ground, right? That's sort of the left wing of the environmental movement. I understand why they think that, but that position doesn't have enough humility in it for me. I feel like we don't know the answer yet, so let's not pretend we do.
Thanks, Franz. I also noticed, I think one of your humble statements and true statements is people are concerned but don't want to pay for the higher rates that might come along with more wind, more energy, more solar, etc. And that's what we are hearing from most utilities, including Ameren, of course. So, it's the same old thing about people in general. We like to be responsible, but we don't want to pay for it. We don't want to pay our taxes, etc. So, thanks.
We've moved past 11 a.m. time and noon for those of you on the East Coast. Maybe is there one final question somebody would like to offer before we wrap up? Maybe I'll ask one then, which is this to both Franz and Dan. As shareholders, one of the bodies that we need to be able to influence would especially be like the state regulators, utility commissions and the like. Do you have any words for us in terms of how we think about our engagement with those bodies?
Dan, do you want to go, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's not that much history of engagement between shareholders and state regulators, although we have been facilitating some because I think it is important for the state regulators and legislators to hear from investors, but at a certain level, like most shareholders don't want to engage deep in the weeds of the regulatory discussions, but there is a role for them to weigh in on the way that they're seeing things and the reason for their interest and concern around climate and clean energy. So I would just say that there are opportunities to engage, and it just should be at the right at the right level that is appropriate for investors to be engaging in the regulatory process.
I would just very quickly say, on this question of carbon risk, regulators are not in a vacuum. They recognize, they see all of these targets, and the targets, I think, in some respect, are statements about what is prudent about making these long-term investments that are needed, and so that's part of the calculus for a regulator when approving investments. However, I'll go back to and end on this point. it's real easy now, 2 years after we were talking about the Clean Power Plan, to have very fresh in our minds that we're going to have a carbon constraint on power plants eventually, that's likely. If 10 years passes and we still don't have that constraint, then if I'm a regulator, it's much harder for me to think about carbon as being really in the mix. So right now we're sort of assuming there will be a policy in place eventually, and that's part of the reason making these investments make sense. Ultimately, that policy has to materialize.
Yeah, this is Barbara. I think another venue or way to go to regulators, to state, to, for instance, our Missouri Department of Natural Resources, is to point out the future expenses of the state when they have to clean up the messes from climate change. For instance, here in Missouri, the main risk is floods. And floods could not only ruin the water systems, but, well, and it's, more predicted here because of climate change. So it is the state and the US government that will have to pay for all the cleanup, all of the homes that are lost, the insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one way that they really understand is, oh, how are we going to get this money? Houston, I think Houston is a great example.
Yeah. Well, and I think that argument kind of underscores the prudence point as well, that both both the utilities and the regulators need to be encouraged to take a prudent decision. Mm-hmm. For Frank and I want to thank everybody for being here, especially thank Franz and Dan for their preparation and for their long commitment in work around this area and for sharing their wisdom with us. I believe it's been a fruitful time for all of us. And please know that we'll be sending out slides and an evaluation of this. Your feedback is really helpful. It helps us improve these webinars. If you've gotten this directly from us through our email distribution list, you'll find an update through that. If you have not, just visit our website, seventhgenerationinterfaith.org, and under the blog, the leading entry under news will be about this webinar. And again, thank you all for your time. Thank you especially again to Dan and to Franz and to Frank. And we'll see you before long.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.